Hey, welcome to Real Talk, where I give real answers to real questions from real worship leaders. If you are a real worship leader with a real question and you want a real answer, submit your question right here, and I just might answer it on a future episode. Today is a very special episode because today, according to my calculations, is episode 100 of Real Talk. That is right. Over the past, I think it's been like a year and a half now, I've answered over 200 of your questions. So, first of all, thank you so much for sending in your questions. This series literally could not exist without you taking the time to head to my website, fill out the form with your question, and not being afraid to ask your question. So, I will continue to answer your questions as long as you keep sending them in. And I just want to encourage you, if you've been watching this for 100 episodes and you have never sent in a question, now is the time to do it. The link is right there down in the description below. It's so easy to do. You just type in your question, I receive it, and then I will answer it, hopefully, at some point in a future episode. So if you've never done that before, to celebrate the 100th episode of Real Talk, please do that. Send me your question. I love to answer your questions, and the more questions I have to sort through, the better questions come to the top, and the better these episodes are. Now, to celebrate the 100th episode of Real Talk, I've answered over 200 worship leader questions. I want to give you, I'm not going to answer any questions in this video, but I want to give you 5 things that I've noticed as I've answered all of these worship leading questions, because if you've watched these episodes for any length of time, you will notice some commonalities between the questions, and within those commonalities, I have identified basically 5 pain points that worship team leaders or worship leaders have, and I think if I just share these 5, I think they're solutions, I suppose, 5 things that you should do, I think they would probably solve 95% of the problems of the questions that were sent in to me. So here are 5 things I've learned answering 200 worship leading questions over the past 2 years. The first solution is this: 99% of conflict can be resolved by simply talking to the person you have an issue with. I can't tell you how many questions I've gotten over these 100 episodes where it makes me want to ask the question to the person who sent in the question. You say you have a problem with this person, this worship team member who's not prepared, this worship team leader who isn't resourcing you well, this pastor who you disagree with, this church member who criticizes you and you don't like it, this bad worship team member who is causing conflict on your team. It makes me want to ask the question, have you talked to them about it? Because I get the feeling that it's so easy to vent our feelings online through an online form, and maybe it's cathartic for us to write out our feelings on the internet or send Spencer a long email that's like not formatted at all and like 100 sentences in one paragraph. And it's like, sometimes I don't even respond to those. If you sent me an email like that and I haven't responded to that, I'm sorry, I don't really have time to read like a huge email. I have other things going on. I want to help you if you send me a quick question, but man, sometimes people send me emails and I'm like, you know what? As I read this, I think it was just for them to get their thoughts out. I don't even think they need an answer necessarily. I think it was just good for them, or they thought it was good for them to get their feelings out, write it down. It helped them process it. But unless you go talk to the person that you had a problem with, your problem is not going to be solved. It might feel good in the moment. I feel like I heard somebody talk about this before, where they were talking about how in therapy, like, there's like good kinds of therapy, and by the way, I'm not qualified to talk on this at all, but there's like good kinds of therapy where people find solutions to their problems, and then there's bad kinds of therapies where people just complain about their problems, and they think as they're complaining about the problems, they're finding a solution because it feels good to talk to somebody about it, but they never take the action to fix it in their lives. Like, I feel like sometimes that's what happens with Real Talk, is like, it is a cathartic experience where it feels good to share your problems with somebody. But if you actually wanted to solve your problem, you would do the difficult work of going to that person and talking to them about it. I'm telling you, this will solve 99% of the interpersonal conflicts, whether that is a worship team member who's not prepared, Don't think I'm going to give you some secret subliminal thing that you can do that's finally going to make the switch click in their mind. What am I going to tell you? I'm going to tell you, go talk to that person and say, listen, I've noticed that you haven't been prepared to lead worship, that you haven't known your musical parts. Is there something I need to do to resource you better? And if they say no, then you say, okay, well, let me know if there is, but I need you to learn your guitar part. That's an expectation for members on our worship team. And then you hold them to that expectation. But it starts with the conversation with that person. If somebody's causing conflict on your worship team and there are people fighting on your worship team, I'm not going to give you some subliminal thing that you can do where you like do a Jedi mind trick and you don't really have to deal with the problem, but somehow a switch is flipped and it's magically solved. I'm going to say, sit those two people down, talk to them about the problem, and as they talk it out, the solution will be solved. All right, that is literally 99% of the interpersonal conflict questions that I get on Real Talk. So do that. I know it's not the easy answer, but it is, number one, the right answer, and number two, the only answer that will ultimately solve your problem. The second trend that I've noticed in these 200 questions that I've answered, this has come up time and time again, and I've never heard anyone else talk about this before. But there have been so many questions where it's been like, hey, Spencer, my pastor's on the worship team with me, and it's causing problems because of ... And it seems to me a trend is, and I'm not saying that this is always the case, but if your pastor is on your worship team, there will be a power struggle or something along those lines. There will be some interesting dynamic that is hard to deal with. And I think it just goes along with like the position. Like when we think of the pastor, and I'm talking about like the senior pastor or even like an associate pastor, I guess, like they are shepherding the church. And so if you are in charge of the worship team, then you're in charge of that one section. But I've seen it over and over again. Worship team members, if the pastor is on the worship team, sometimes even if the pastor isn't on the worship team, but if the pastor is on the worship team, they will assume that the person with higher authority in the church or a higher title in the church, not just worship team leader, but senior pastor, they will assume that they're the ones that they should talk to. That they should skip over the worship team leader because the pastor's there, so I'll just talk to the pastor. And unless your pastor is very intentional about saying, I am not the one that you talk to about this problem, you talk to the person beneath me about this problem, then it's always going to cause trouble because you're going to feel like people are going around you trying to jump over your leadership position. And I'm so grateful for my pastor because he constantly does this. He tells me so many times, he's like, this person came to me and said something about, you know, I don't know, the worship space or something. And he says, I told them that's Spencer's area, so go talk to him about that. And I'm so appreciative of that. But most pastors don't do that. And that's what they should be doing. They'll just answer the question and make a decision because that's what they're used to doing. So if you are a senior pastor and you're on the worship team, one of two things needs to happen. First of all, consider, like, do I really need to be doing everything in my church? You already have a full plate if you're a senior pastor, if you're preaching on Sundays. This is why sometimes I preach at my church. And when I preach at my church, I never lead worship the same morning because I already have enough to do with preaching, but also I don't want it to seem like the Spencer show up there where like he just does everything here, right? Consider what you're communicating to your church. He just does everything here. He plays electric guitar. He fixes the clogged toilets. And I'm not saying that you can't do that if you're the pastor. I'm just saying there's other people who can probably do it in your church too. He preaches. He leads all the meetings. He does everything here. You have an important role, but you don't need to do everything in your church. That's how you will burn out. So if you're a pastor, that's one thing to consider. I would consider, do I even need to be on the worship team? Is it that important that my worship team has an electric guitar player every Sunday? Probably not. And then the other thing I would consider is if you're like, yes, I do need to be on the worship team, just make sure that you are constantly pointing people to the person who is actually the leader on the worship team. And quit making worship team leader level decisions without at least talking to your worship team leader about it, because you will just frustrate them in the process. Speaking of leaders on the worship team, here's something else that I've noticed that comes up time and time again in the questions on Real Talk, is that there is always a problem when there is more than one leader on your worship team. I can't tell you how many questions I've gotten that start with the caveat, hey, Spencer, I'm having this problem on my worship team. Me and my other worship leaders are all in charge of the worship ministry and X, Y, and Z. Like over and over again. It's like, how do you have 4 people leading your worship ministry? That doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to make the final decision. And maybe it does work in some churches and there just aren't any problems, so nobody ever sends those questions in on Real Talk. But I've seen that over and over and over again. At the end of the day, there needs to be somebody who makes the final decision, because one of 2 things is going to happen. Either you think that you all have equal leadership responsibility and one person thinks that the worship ministry should go this way, one person thinks the worship ministry should go this way, so on and so forth, and you're pulled in 4 different directions and you don't have a cohesive worship ministry. Or what I've seen in Real Talk questions too is that nobody knows who's in charge and therefore no decisions get made. So either everybody makes their own decision, or your pastor has said, hey, I want you, and you to share responsibilities of leading the worship team. And it's like, well, I'm not really in charge, so the other person will do it. And then nobody ends up making any decisions in the worship ministry. Now, I don't know what the solution for that is if you serve in that environment, because that's a hard conversation to have. I think maybe you talk to your pastor about it and say, it seems like a struggle for us to all lead together. It seems like for us all to have equal authority on the worship team means that nobody really has any leadership authority on the worship team. And as I'm saying this, I am like thinking about elders in the church, like there should be a plurality of elders. So maybe balance your thoughts out with, or balance my thoughts out with that thought too. I don't have time to process all those thoughts right now, but just popped into my head. I'm like, there should be a plurality of elders in the church, and it's not like one person should be in charge of everything, making all the decisions. So I don't know. It just seems like it's always a problem specifically in the worship ministry because leadership roles are not clearly defined. So make sure leadership roles in your worship ministry are clearly defined. The 4th thing I've noticed, and this is probably the biggest frustration from worship team members, and I will put it in an imperative command. Worship leaders, send your songs out at the very least at the beginning of the week. Send your set list out at the beginning of the week. If you can do it 2 weeks before, even better, but at the bare minimum, at the beginning of the week, that's Monday or Tuesday, but at least, I'll say 3 days before your worship rehearsal, you should be sending out your song list. And that's being like very generous, by the way. And you have to know your team on this too. Some teams, they've been playing together for a long time. Understand though, as new worship team members come in, they're going to need the songs earlier. So just maybe get in the routine of sending it out 2 weeks early. But this is the #1 frustration for worship team members. Over and over again, my worship team leader doesn't pick out songs until rehearsal, or my worship team leader doesn't pick out songs until Sunday morning. Do you know how incredibly frustrating that is for your worship team? People don't like to not be able to play the songs well. We have a hard enough time getting our team to prepare when we do send out the set list early. Do you know how many worship leaders complain that their worship team doesn't prepare even though they send out the set list early? Here you are. You have a worship team that wants to prepare in advance, but you are the bottleneck. If you could fix one thing in your worship ministry, one logistical thing, this is it. Getting your worship team to the set list early in the week is your highest logistical responsibility. It's not the highest spiritual responsibility, but we want to resource our teams well. Your team will love you for that if you send out the songs 2 weeks in advance. They will love you for that because they will have time to actually learn the songs, and it's not that hard to do. The Holy Spirit doesn't just work on Sunday mornings an hour before the service starts. The Holy Spirit lives inside of you, giving you wisdom to pick out songs 2 weeks before. Imagine believing in an eternal God who exists outside of time, and you think, I need to wait until Sunday morning because that's when the Holy Spirit reveals the songs to me. I will not back down on that statement. I had some comments on I made that comment, something like that, on a video several weeks ago, and I had some comments that were like, Spencer, you are being too religious, and the Spirit, you need to follow the Spirit. I'm like, the Spirit doesn't just lead on Sunday mornings. I'm not going to back down from that statement. Quit over-spiritualizing your set list by thinking that the more spontaneous you are, the more spiritual it is. I'm not saying that you can't ever be spontaneous in picking songs, and there might be some rare Sunday where you're like, man, I got that song wrong, and I need to switch it out last minute. I would never like to do that to my team, but if I really felt it in my soul that, man, we need to sing this song, then I would do that. But I'm not going to do it every week and feel more spiritual about myself because I planned it an hour before the service starts. So worship leaders, send your songs out at the beginning of the week. And number 5, this would solve so many of the questions that I get about expectations on the worship team. People aren't prepared. Maybe you need to send out the songs earlier, but the solution for a lot of the questions about worship team members are late, they're not living like they should be spiritually, morally, whatever it is, just set clear expectations for your team and then hold them to those standards. This is why I put together the worship team toolkit, which I'll link down in the description below. In that, you will find the code of conduct that I have for my team. You can take it and copy and paste it and put it right into your worship ministry. But we must communicate our expectations to our worship team clearly. That way, they know what we expect of them. A lot of times people send in questions on Real Talk, and they're like, my worship team doesn't show up on time, they're not prepared. And I'm like, I know it seems obvious to us as people who have been on the worship team and as leaders who put in a lot of time into the worship ministry, it seems obvious to us that people should be on time, that people should be prepared, but it's not sometimes. So how do we make it obvious? We tell them when they join the team, hey, this is the expectation. I'm going to send out the set list 2 weeks early or at the beginning of the week, and it's expected that when you come to rehearsal, that it's rehearsal and it's not practice. We aren't there to learn the songs, but we are there to run through our parts with the rest of the people in the band so that we can learn how to play the songs together, and we expect people to be on time. If you state these things up front, it'll be a lot less awkward when you have to address them in the future. Because you can point back to the previous conversation that you have. You can point back to the code of conduct that you gave them when they joined the worship team and say, listen, this is what we talked about when you first joined the worship team, and I've noticed that you've started showing up 20 minutes late to rehearsal, and that really hurts the team because now we either have to wait for you or we have to run through songs again. And so you have a conversation with them, pointing them back to the expectations that you've already set. But if you have never set expectations in the first place, then you have nothing to point them back to and no foundation to stand on. So set clear expectations for your worship team. It will solve so many of your problems. If you need help setting clear expectations for your worship team, check out the worship team toolkit linked down in the description below. I've got my code of conduct there. I've got my worship team application form. You can copy and paste those right into your worship ministry. Other than that, thanks so much for watching 100 episodes of Real Talk. We've got more to come. Till I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.